Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Clone Wars traumatized the galaxy more than people realize. In the Clone Wars TV series, and in the prequels, we only see things from the Jedi and clones' point of view. We don't really understand just how devastating the conflict was to the average person. The trauma was so great, and at an individual level, it led to overwhelming support for Palpatine to dissolve the Republic and establish a far stronger galactic empire. The most visceral images seared into the minds of Republic citizens as they cheered on Palpatine's rise were legions of Imperial warships blockading planets, buzz droids ripping apart commercial and passenger liners in hyperspace, and of course, massive parade formations of droids entering cities and massacring entire populaces. These images left such an impression on the galaxy that, especially in areas in the Outer Rim where most of the major Clone Wars battles were fought, there was still a lingering and severe hatred for droids. Some people refused to work with them, others banned them from their establishments, and that sentiment carried on all the way through the Galactic Civil War to the New Republic era as well. But there's a much less talked about disaster created by the Clone Wars that ultimately probably killed even more people than the fighting actually did. And that was the destruction of the galactic economy and the severing of many of the major trade routes that supplied the galaxy's citizens. You see, 30,000 years earlier, the Rakatan Infinite Empire collapsed, and a miracle happened in the center of the galaxy. A bunch of mostly humans, former captives of the Rakatans, came together and established a new form of government, a republic. And so instead of seeking to dominate, enslave, and force their will on others, the founders of the republic valued cooperation, and in their founding charter, they outlined the rights of all sentients, and they also outlawed slavery. You see, for most of galactic history, the empires that were created, the large factions that were created, were pretty simplistic about their view of society and civilization. They adopted a very backwards, zero-sum game mentality. The Rakans have been gifted the power of the dark side by an advanced species and immediately started attacking other worlds and seizing territory. Their gain was equal to the loss of others. Zero-sum game. And so one group of aliens managed to create terrible suffering for most of the center of the galaxy, enslaving dozens of species, glassing entire worlds, destroying entire cultures. The Sith Empire also harbored a very similar mentality, as did the Eternal Empire to a certain degree. There are also countless non-aligned planets. A lot of these planets had less advanced and more primitive civilizations, and therefore these planets were war-torn and full of small tribes and factions that constantly fought against each other. That's kind of the default setting for sentient beings when society is not well organized and fragmented. But believe it or not, I don't think species like humans at their default are aligned with zero-sum game mentality. I think it is actually something created by fear and mistrust. I would argue that we evolved from lower species specifically because we learned how to abandon such thinking and became less animalistic, less focused on zero-sum game mentality, and more cooperative. We started living in tribes, we started sharing resources, we eventually developed cities. When humanity started adopting this positive sum mindset, or the idea that cooperation and interaction leads to an increase in total value so all parties can come ahead, that is when we truly started thriving. But shifting your society's thinking from zero-sum thinking to positive-sum thinking is very difficult. You need a society of abundance where people are fully fed and fully clothed before you experiment with this idea that cooperation can expand the pie and not just divide it. This is the opposite of scarcity thinking, where one believes that there are only limited resources in the world, which of course leads to hoarding, excessive competition, and greed. You also need to make sure that people can trust in their neighbors, that their neighbors will sign on to the same social contract that you did, to not steal, to not kill, to not let your dog shit all over the sidewalk. A balanced and fair legal system needs to be created. A rule of law also needs to be enforced. This is important to maintain a cohesive society where all different types of people can thrive and live alongside each other. And that system needs to be so robust that it can convince more individualistic people like myself to also buy into this system. Like, naturally, I would say that I don't like depending on the government for anything. I don't like having much interaction with the government. Like, in my ideal situation, I would love to have a massive field artillery gun right at this window so I could shoot at stuff in the water. Not because I'm violent or I'm angry or crazy. I just like big war machines. I don't know. But I don't do this for the sake of stability in my neighborhood. I know it would frighten people if I was firing, high-velocity shells into the water from here. And so you also need education and a culture of empathy to understand that we do live in a very diverse society where there are people of all different types of backgrounds and needs. We need to make a system that somehow meets the needs for everyone, which of course is impossible. But the more secure people feel, the more happy and safe they are, the further they remove themselves from this zero-sum mindset, which can also spread and destroy societies. The Galactic Republic somehow managed to do this not just at the local level or even planetary level. They figured out how to do it at the galactic level, which allowed them to unlock the full potential of trillions of living beings, creating the most formidable and longest-lasting civilization in galactic history. In the first few centuries, the Republic only had a few core worlds like Coruscant, Alderaan, Corellia, Chandrilla, Tallahassee, Kamas. And while these worlds had their own cultural and political rivalries, there was great unity and appreciation for each other as well. This wasn't just because of the Republic's democratic foundations, which invites power sharing. Democracies by nature are very fickle things. A democracy is at the same time one of the strongest systems and also one of the weakest systems. And that is because this system is designed to directly reflect the will of the people and their culture, mindset, and health. If a nation is not healthy, if there are huge economic problems, disparity, inequality, Purgles randomly crashing into starliners, if the average moisture farmer doesn't really have time to sit down and think about the various policies of all of the candidates running for local office because they're constantly being chased around by raiders on speeders, then democracies struggle. People vote for dangerous and extreme voices who promise reform but instead deliver more suffering and drive the populace further apart. In a really poorly managed system, you get civil war, you get conflict, you get social unrest. The Republic's representative democracy was strengthened by a strong electorate, which was interconnected by an advanced free market. There was a very robust exchange of culture and goods that helped foster togetherness in the Republic. People loved flying Correlian ships, they loved Alderaanian poetry, they loved watching Coruscanti HoloNet films of the Undercity, and they loved consuming Tallahassee Floridian cuisine. And most importantly, such a system allowed the galactic economy to flourish and grow at extremely fast rates. The opposite of this would be mercantilism, where you have a bunch of different actors, state-level actors, that believe in a zero-sum mentality. And so each nation, each actor hoards gold and blocks import from other countries, which then of course leads to artificial shortages of certain resources in certain nations, which leads to war, both trade wars and actual physical confrontations. These wars are very destructive. They usually make society less stable, they destroy resources, and both parties in a conflict usually lose. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at modern history, the nations that have remained non-aligned in most global conflicts are the ones that have probably done the best in recent history, like Switzerland. The Republic understood that a zero-sum mentality when there's a galaxy full of resources is idiotic and very limiting, which is why they try to foster a very open and connected galactic community. I mean, why would Corellia and Alderaan fight over the same erodium deposit in the core regions when there are dozens of these in the mid-rim and outer rim? But to get there, the Republic needed to upgrade its shipbuilding technology. It needed to upgrade its mining industries. The Republic needed to make the galaxy see that trade was something that created mutual gain for everyone involved. And more importantly, as planets started trading more and more with their neighbors, they started developing more trust and economic relations. You also started seeing planets specialize in certain industries. This is the real power complex galactic economies can leverage. Every founding planet in the core region initially had the ability to create everything that they needed, from food, medicine, more advanced technologies like hyperdrive and starships. But what ends up happening is because the Republic is a free trade system, you start seeing competition from a bunch of different planets producing the same products, and usually the planet with the most advantages, whether it's they have the skill or they have the resources to produce this product, they start controlling more market share, and more importantly, they start to expand their operations and specialize. Corellia, for instance, was a very unique star system. It had 5 inhabitable planets, and so there was always a great need for intersystem travel. As such, they became one of the predominant shipbuilding systems in the galaxy. Their domestic demand was huge, which means larger scale factories for production and more advancements in technology, which in turn created an even more complex and choosy consumer who wanted more from their products. And eventually, a culture of exploration rooted itself on the planet as well because of that abundance of ships. Coruscant and Alderaan were also known for shipbuilding, and they started drifting into their own niche as well. When it comes to small and mid-sized vessels, no one was really able to beat the scale and skill of Correlian shipwrights. This allowed the Correlians to specialize in this type of starship, making them far more advanced and, more importantly, far more affordable, so that people who previously couldn't really afford a starship now could buy one. As a matter of fact, before the Correlians entered the scene, it was usually just corporations and entire nations that had starships. Now, it became possible for the average individual to own and captain their own starship. That was game-changing. In this case, the Correlians win by becoming wealthy as shipbuilders, and the Republic wins because more people can afford to captain their own ship and explore the galaxy, expanding the Republic's influence. Within a few decades, the Republic's economy had become highly specialized. Every planet basically had a few different industries that they were really good at, and they focused on those things. Alderaan was known for its fertile soil and its rich culture. It became a premier destination for lovers of wine, which isn't just about taste, but perception that branding creates. And soon what you had was a market economy with highly efficient and affordable goods that meant that the average consumer could afford everything. And this was really powerful, as the Republic started expanding out of the core regions into the expansion area. They didn't really need to bring giant fleets of warships or anything. They just brought trade goods. Instead of taking over territory, new species just voluntarily joined the Republic. They were won over not by tanks and starships, but with one of the largest and most complex markets the galaxy had ever seen. Even planets that were initially very xenophobic and isolationist, like the Umbara and Skakoans and the Naboo and the Kaminoans, eventually saw the advantages of joining the galactic economy and became member states of the Republic. These more isolationist planets were mostly export-oriented, and like the people, the Skakoans, the Kaminoans, and Barans, they still didn't really travel off their planet much, but still, even they enjoyed the influx of wealth and new technology that their membership to the Republic gave their people. Now, there are no perfect systems. I've always said that a Republic is probably the least worst out of all of the horrible systems or horrible ways you can organize people. Because when you organize people, a certain percentage of people do lose their ability to do what they want, right? That freedom, individualistic side of me is always resistant to larger organizations in society because of this. And the Republic's growth model eventually ran into challenges as well. When you settle most of the known galaxy, you begin running out of new regions to explore and exploit. Your economic model also begins to slow down. The core region of the Republic by this time was beyond wealthy because of all this growth. They became greedy and complacent and refused to allocate the necessary resources to pacify and settle the Outer Rim in the last centuries of the Republic. Crime and chaos ran rampant in the Outer Rim, and the Republic citizens that lived in these regions felt neglected, and they became very resentful against the elites living in the center of the galaxy. The Outer Rim would eventually go into a huge problem for the Republic, especially with the Sith and the rest of the Republic's enemies gathering in these regions. The other problem with the Republic's massive economy was that specialization eventually led to hyper-specialization. And with any system, with any type of behavior, if you go too extreme, you run into problems. Worlds no longer really needed to produce everything on their own, and this was thanks to 1,000 years of peace. Trade routes had become so stable and predictable that you had a certain level of complacency and dependence on the galactic economy for very basic items. This led to worlds like Gorman, which literally is a single product economy, as in it produces just one single item and is heavily dependent on imports. This made the Gormans especially vulnerable to sanctions and economic blockades, which of course the Empire exploited. And if we take a look at the last years of the Republic, there were plenty of blockades and economic sanctions leveraged by malicious actors to apply political pressure on worlds they wanted to control. When the Trade Federation blockaded Naboo, there was immediately a food shortage on the planet. You might be wondering to yourself, Alan, Naboo looks like the lake country in northern Italy. How come they don't have their own agricultural products? Well, because of specialization, Naboo did have agricultural products, but these were mainly destined for export. And so there wasn't really a supply chain or a system to take those goods and deliver it to more populated cities, where you have a bunch of urban folks who can't produce their own food and mostly depend on imports from much cheaper agricultural worlds that produce basic goods. In Star Wars, you had massive agricultural systems where you literally had entire planets that were devoted to just growing one single crop or raising one single type of livestock. Then you had worlds like Mandalore, which had been destroyed by conflict. The surface of the planet was irradiated in many places, and the main capital city of Sindaria was located inside of a climate-controlled dome. Worlds like Mandalore couldn't really exist without a complex advanced market and stable trade routes. They were almost 100% dependent on imported food and drink. And during the Clone Wars, Duchess Septine Crest took a principled and idealistic stance against the war and declared themselves neutral. To make matters worse, they headed a council of neutral systems, which formed quite a large and powerful bloc in opposition to both sides of the conflict and, naturally, the Sith. This caught the Sith's attention, and they naturally tried to destabilize the Mandalorians by cutting off their trade routes in the area by creating large battles in the region. This would lead to the Mandalorians inviting smugglers and black marketeers to provide essential foodstuffs to their populace, which eventually led to an entire criminal armada arriving on the planet and taking over everything. This is really one of the deadliest problems created by the Clone Wars. It was the silent killer. The growth and expansion of the Republic's economy had been heavily dependent on stability and, most importantly, free and open trade routes. The Clone Wars was a uniquely devastating conflict because there were really no geographical boundaries that, created a front line. I mean, there were just hotspots all over the galaxy that cut off trade routes randomly. You could have a pro-Republic world right next to a pro-Separatist world, and although most of the Separatist worlds were concentrated in the Outer Rim, this wasn't always the case. And so, basically, outside of the core regions of the Republic, trade was heavily affected and interrupted almost everywhere. And if you had a planet that wasn't prepared, well, you suffered greatly. Your people would run into food shortages in medicine and energy even. When the Separatist forces arrived on Ryloth and blockaded the planet, local food reserves quickly ran out and the locals became heavily dependent on Republic blockade runners delivering supplies. The same thing happened to Christophsis, which was an entire world covered in crystals, which made it poor for agricultural production. Republic blockaders also saved the day in that situation. In the middle of the Clone Wars, the Trade Federation, which was technically still a part of the Republic, blockaded the world of Pantora over outstanding debts. It was basically Naboo Part 2. And once again, the Pantorans struggled because of a dependence on importing foodstuff. The Sith were really smart. They kind of understood how the galactic economy worked, and they saw vulnerabilities that could be easily exploited, which could, lead to political upheaval and the rise of their separatist movement. This is an interesting concept to think about, and it's scalable to many levels of society. For instance, I love living in urban areas. I love cities because I have access to food and culture from all over the world. It's really nice. The problem is I've also seen the downside to this, like when we had minor disasters like Hurricane Sandy, or we had the 2020 pandemic. You do see a disruption in local food supplies, and it's said that most groceries in these urban areas have enough food for like 3 days. And so if the trucks stop running, if the warehouse is shut down, then people start to run out of food. Now, luckily that didn't happen during the hurricane or during the 2020 pandemic, thanks to all of our very important and underappreciated logistics and warehouse workers. But this is something we really need to think about. The more complex markets become, the more efficient they are, the more dependent we all become on them. But they are not always going to be there, which again is why it's important to remember balance is important in all aspects of society. And probably a city like New York is going to run into a lot of problems because it is completely imbalanced. It's not a city that can sustain itself in food. And this is something that is affecting a lot of large cities in the world. Like Hong Kong has a sustainability crisis. Singapore does as well. They're looking into different ways to provide food for themselves. Like you can have vertical farming inside of skyscrapers. You can have, certain public ordinances which require you to have a rooftop garden, stuff like that. And this also happens naturally. I mean, in the United States, more and more people are keeping small gardens in their homes, growing vegetables and spices. People are raising chickens and ducks in their backyards to collect eggs and meat eventually. I mean, even in the heart of the city, I see, again, rooftop shared gardens and communal gardens with food, which is great. I mean, even I'm trying to grow, do I have cilantro? I got cilantro by the window because I don't want to pay $5 for spices, It's a start. And I think this trend of becoming more self-sufficient in the United States is directly related to the chaos we've experienced in the country in the last 10 years. And it's an important reminder to be optimistic about our species because we are very, very adaptable. You know, whenever there are problems and crises, whenever we go through, a tragedy or some disaster, we change how we see the world and we adapt. I mean, that is one of our greatest strengths. And so as long as we keep an open mind, as long as we stay rational, we don't let emotion affect us, as long as we continue working together as a society and believing that we don't live in a zero-sum environment, I think any crisis we encounter, we can prevail over. And it's important we remember that aspect about our species because cooperation really is in our DNA. Humans didn't become the dominant species on the planet because we're stronger or larger or more terrifying than other animals. It's really because we're one of the first animals on this planet that stopped killing each other, and then we actually started communicating and working together, trading. That is our biggest strength, and we do need to preserve it. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.